Welcome back. You know who I am, and it's another episode. Hopefully, everything's been going well. Been busy as hell these days. I got some big news for you, so let's start off with that. Channel 4 News, WTAE, here in Pittsburgh, is doing a three-part special on first responders and mental health. That'll be airing November 10th, 11th, and 13th at 5:30 p.m. For those of you who like military time, that's 17:30. Once it's aired completely, all three parts, it will then be on their website to stream. And I was lucky enough to be able to interview with Sheldon Ingram from Channel 4 News, tell him a little bit about my opinions on mental health. It's a really big thing for me, the whole mental health and first responders, because of my background and the things that I went through. So it's really great that they're drawing some light to it, and they're going to be doing something really, really good for the folks that are suffering from it right now. So it's great that we can, put the word out there. I believe he's also interviewing some other podcasters here in Pittsburgh and some other people to get different opinions from, the fire department, police department, dispatchers, EMS. So it's not just about police. So if you are a first responder, veteran, or you have family members or friends that are either, definitely check it out. Once again, that's going to be November 10th, 11th, and 13th at 5:30 p.m. And it'll be available on their website once it airs in all three parts in completion. So let's get into it. What do I want to talk about today? I'd like to talk about a couple things if I get to it. I'm going to start off talking about relapse. And if we get to it, we'll go into triggers, new things to try to keep this down to an hour or less, just so you guys don't get too bored. And I run out of things to talk about. So, relapse. What is it? What do you think, folks? What do you think relapse is? I'm going to give you my opinion. A lot of people think that relapse is when you take your first drink or when you use again. And I disagree. I believe that relapse is when you let the idea of thinking about the possibility of drinking or using again, that is the relapse. That's when the relapse starts. It's not, in my mind, the act of taking that drink or using that substance. It's the act of falling off the wagon mentally and not being able to deal with the signs that you're getting way in advance. What do you mean, Mark? Well, for me, thank God I haven't had too much to deal with in the way of relapse, but I've had my moments. And I would say I probably was early on, I probably had at least one time where I was in relapse. It was when my friend Kenny Finnegan died on his motorcycle. This was back in June 1st of 2024. Holy shit, that's a long time ago. Yeah, so, when that happened, I started getting depressed and I started to get upset. I started to get worked up, and I didn't catch it right away, and it continued to fester, and I continued to get depressed about it, and my behavior started to change. I started to become more irritable. I started to become a little bit more aggressive. I wasn't focused at work as much. I was having, little arguments with my wife, at that time, my fiance, or at that time, my girlfriend back then. But yeah, so, what do we do? What do we do when we start to have those feelings or even the inkling of a thought that we might be able to drink again or we might be able to use again? Well, this is going to fall back. And once again, I am no doctor. I am no genius. If you're looking for the answers to everything in life, I am the wrong fucking guy. I, as always, just talk about what I went through and my experiences because I feel that's the only way I can help anybody. But so I mentioned it before. We have a warrior plan in recovery. We have a plan of action of how we're going to battle our addiction or our mental health. So it comes back to self-awareness. It's probably the most important thing we have in recovery. We can be determined, we can be dedicated, we can be hard-willed, we can be motivated. But once again, if we don't know who we are inside, what we do and why we do it, and what our character flaws are and what the things are we need to work on, it's like throwing money at a fucking blackjack table. You may hit, you may not. But the self-awareness aspect, we have to be able to recognize when our defenses are weak or our defenses are down or we're starting to feel some kind of way. For me, once again, I get aggressive, I get short-tempered, I get irritable, I start wanting not to do anything. I just want to lay around and be a bum all day. It could be anything. Those of you out there who are battling addiction, you know what your signs are. You know when you're starting to struggle. So what do? Well, as always, we have to share with someone. We have to sit down and talk to someone and let them know what we're thinking, what we're feeling. Because if we hold on to those feelings and we hold on to those thoughts, it really won't allow us to get through and to move forward. There's that thing called cognitive behavioral therapy, and I've talked about it a few times, and I'm not an expert, but my understanding of it is that, throughout life, we build these patterns, we build these pre-programmed responses to inputs, so as a kid, you're 5 years old, you burn your hand on a stove. What don't you do tomorrow? You don't touch the stove. You build that awareness that there's a repercussion or a consequence with these inputs, right? So we get these inputs, we build these patterns, and over time, these patterns are solidified like the programming of a computer. And, for example, it could be, you argue with your girlfriend or your boyfriend, and you immediately get upset. You start sweating, you get angry, you get upset, you start questioning whether you guys are going to be okay. All the gamut of thoughts start to go through your head. So what happens is, over time, you react that same way to that type of input. You start to assign an emotion and an emotional response to that input. So, the input is the fight with your girlfriend or boyfriend. The emotional response is the nervousness, the being upset, the being angry, the overthinking, the going manic. And then that emotion leads us into a behavior. For me, it was drinking. For you, it might be using or, just not talking to anybody. But these patterns are an input that leads to an emotional response or has an emotional connection, and that leads into a behavior that we've done over and over and over and over again. And until we break those cycles, until we break those patterns, there really is no way for us to stay sober and stay mentally well, because we know that something's not right and we don't do anything about it. So, when we start to have those feelings in early stages of relapse, where we start to think that, hey, I might want to have a drink, this kind of thing's going on, that kind of thing's going on, we have to be able to realize right away that that's what's happening, right? Our weaknesses are low or high, our defenses are down, and we're in a position where we are very vulnerable to drinking or using. So that's where you look back to your warrior plan. That's where you look back to what you've been doing that's been working and go down the list, check off every item, make sure you're doing it. Meditation, yes. Breathing work, yes. 8 hours of sleep, yes. Going to the gym, no. Talking to my therapist, no. When you start to get those no's, you got to get those things back in alignment, and maybe your plan has changed a little bit. Mine has over time. But the key is you have to have that plan, because without that plan, you're just, throwing darts at the wall and hoping you hit a bullseye. And we all know that that's not easy to do. Probably was a lot easier when we were drunk, but, we have to be ready to face these moments head on, and they could be the littlest thing. It could be as much as having a bad day at work, or, you're making breakfast for your husband and you burnt the eggs and now you're upset all day long. It doesn't have to be anything monumental. Now, granted, some of the things are, you know, funerals, big trigger for me, big, 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 big trigger for me. Um, fighting with my girlfriend, my wife, sorry, big trigger. I still get worked up about that stuff, and it's okay for us to be emotional. I'm not saying we can't be emotional human beings. I mean, We're mental, emotional, and physical. We're all three. We don't live a good and happy, productive life unless we're feeling everything, unless we're experiencing life at its fullest. So, when you start to have those feelings, when you start to have those moments of concern for, uh, the idea that you might want to drink again or you might want to use again, you got to turn back to your plan and you got to just work through it. Go back to the basics. If you have to go back to where you were when you went to AA or NA or went to rehab and start from scratch and, revamp your whole plan, then do it. Nobody's going to tell you what you're doing is wrong. And if they are telling you it's wrong, then they need to shut the fuck up because it's your program. It's you determine what you do to get well and stay well. Now, we take the advice and the inputs from the people around us and the people that helped us get sober. But once you get out of rehab, they're gone. It's up to you. It's up to us to maintain the forward trajectory of our recovery and not take steps back. So what happens if you do take a step back? What happens if you don't catch those feelings right away? And, a month down the road, you're at the bar and you have a drink or you use. What do you do then? I mean, a lot of people will tell you that, you've relapsed and now you got to start all over again. And now your sobriety date changes and blah, 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 blah. Listen, that shit doesn't fucking matter. What matters is that, if you have that drink or you use that substance, don't beat yourself up. Don't be overly critical of yourself. We're human beings. We're going to make mistakes. You can rebound from that. It doesn't have to be the end all be all. If I go to the bar, listen, I was sitting in bed with my wife last week and we started talking about my drinking because it's a conversation. She supports what I do with the podcast. So we talk about things. And she was like, do you ever think you're going to be able to drink again? And I was sitting there like, that's a really good question. And I'll be honest with you. I said, I would love to be able to go out to dinner with our friends and have a drink, just one, and be able to come home and be a normal human being, but I'm not there in my recovery. I mean, I'm 29 months in a couple of days, which is amazing for me, but it doesn't seem like much to the normal people. They're like, oh yeah, 2.5 years. You've done a really good job. Yeah, no, really. They don't give a shit. The normies don't care. The normies just see a drunk and an addict, and that's what they see, you know. But I'm having this conversation with my wife, and it was like 10, 15-minute conversation. And I was honest. I was like, listen, right now, if I drink, I'll kill myself. Some way, somehow, whether it's in a car accident or, drinking too much, doing something stupid, or, just my liver shuts down, I don't know. It's not going to end well for me if I drink now. Now, 15 years from now, will I be able to drink? I don't have a magic wand or a crystal ball. I don't know if I'm going to be able to drink. I live every day under the understanding that I cannot drink where I am in my life today. And I think that's a very important thing to remember. It's every single day. A lot of these folks want to think 2, 10, 15 years down the road. And that's really the first conversation I've had where I've even talked about whether or not I would drink in the future because I'm uncomfortable with the idea. I'm really uncomfortable with the idea because I know where I was 29 months ago and I never want to go back there. But, having that conversation and being open and honest about where I am mentally when it comes to drinking. I have friends that are in recovery that still drink. Hey, if you can do it, that's all you. I'm not that person at this point in my recovery, at this point in my mental health recovery. So the answer for me always is going to be no. It has to start with me saying no. People who want to let the door of relapse open, a lot of times you don't say no. You say maybe. Could, maybe, someday. And for me, I can't do that. I have to shut the door on it as soon as I have that thought. It took me almost 2 years before I even had a non-alcoholic beer. And by non-alcoholic, I don't mean 3% alcohol, 0.3% or 0.5%. I mean 0.00. I don't use mouthwash with alcohol. I don't use deodorant with alcohol. I don't use cologne with alcohol. Like, that's me. Now, would I ever think about drinking cologne? No. Sorry. It's not in my game plan ever. But, having it around, not having it around makes me feel better. It makes me feel like I am going above and beyond what I need to do to stay sober. Can I have mouthwash with alcohol in it? Probably. But what's the answer, folks? For me, the answer is always no. The answer is always going to be no. In the near future, as far as I can see in front of me, it's always going to be no. Because if I wake up in the morning and I let a thought in my head and I say, maybe I can drink, then that starts to snowball that whole process where I get to the point one day where I'm like, well, I've been really good. I've been really clean and I've been happy. I deserve to have a drink and I'll just have one and it'll be okay. And it might be. But those two words can kill you. Might be, or maybe. Those are not things we should have in our minds as addicts in recovery. To be honest with you, that's my personal opinion. I think those words are dangerous. I think we have to be definitive. There's no gray in the middle. It's all black and white. It's yes or no, red or green. We have to stick to that, especially in early recovery. We have to stick to the finite answers of yes and no. Don't let the maybes in. Don't let the might be, could be. It could put you into that situation where you start to relapse. Like I said in the beginning, a lot of people disagree. A lot of people think relapse is when you drink or when you use. No, folks, when you finally use or you finally drink, you've already been relapsing. Because in my experience with my mental health issues, and I still believe that, most people that are addicts have some type of mental health issue, whether it's depression, anxiety, whatever, low self-esteem. There's something going on in the brain. It's not an excuse. It's just my opinion. So, if you're starting to feel like your mental health is slipping, or you're starting to feel like, you're losing grasp on some of the things that were easy yesterday, but now they're more difficult today. My advice to you, good old Uncle Marky, is you need to check yourself right then and there. You need to sit down. You need to call somebody. You need to talk to somebody. You need to get it out, journal it, write it down. You need to get these thoughts out of your brain. You need to get the negative juju, the devil's voices out of your head and clean the slate and start over. I'm not saying you're going to fail, but my friends, I'd rather see you catch yourself right when it happens than do what I did for 34 years, and that's get sober for a couple months and then say, hey, I'm good, I'm okay, I've been good, and then I go right back out for another 2 or 3 years and just repeating this deadly cycle of maybe I can, maybe I can, maybe I can. You know what? I probably shouldn't, but I will anyway, and it ends up being you shouldn't have fucking done that because look where you are now. So that's my spiel on relapse, folks. If you have any opinions, steelcityroundtablepodcast.com, steelcityroundtable@gmail.com. All my social medias, you can send me a message. I'd love to see what you have to say. But the second part of this tonight is triggers. Triggers and relapse go hand in hand. When you go to rehab or you go to AA or you go to therapy for addiction, the big thing they're going to focus on is triggers. They're really going to focus on triggers because everybody thinks that something has to happen in your life to make you want to go into relapse and ultimately drink or use. Now, I always give you my opinions. I don't think you have to be triggered to use because the word trigger insinuates an overt stimulus, something that you see or know or, understand it's going to bug you and it happens and it has that triggering effect on you. So it's like they almost make it like a tangible thing. Like I was just triggered. I was just triggered. Now fuck that. There's times I think I'd like to have a drink just because I woke up in the morning and my back hurts. There's no triggering event. I never drank because my back hurt. But the mental health aspect of it says, hey, your guard's down. Your back hurts, your guard's down. Yeah, it'd be great to have a drink, but I don't. So to me, saying triggers are important, I agree with that. We have to be aware of what triggers us. We have to be aware of the overt stimulus that's going to have an effect on us in a negative way that could break down our defenses and lead us down the road of relapse. But it's not going to be isolated to just triggers. Things are going to happen in your daily life that they just get you in a mood, and it could be nothing that you ever drank over. Listen, I'll give you a list of things I drank over. I drank over women. I drank over work. I drank over money. I drank over bills. I drank over, my house not being clean. I drank over being depressed. I drank over having anxiety. Those are overt stimuluses. Those are things that you can look at when they're happening and go, this shit's fucking happening right now. So those are triggers. But there's the little things that happen that I can't tell you what it is because it's so minuscule and it's nothing I drank over before. And since I've been sober, the times I have thought about if I could drink again, it's more often been little things rather than big things. It's been like I stubbed my toe in the morning and I'm in a bad mood and I want to have a drink, you know, or, you know, I got up, I didn't eat breakfast and now my stomach hurts. And well, God, I could go for a drink right now. This day's starting off in a shithole. It's going to suck. But I mean, tell me that's a trigger. You tell me. I don't know. I don't think that's a trigger. Not for me. Because to me, triggers, it ultimately relates to something that's happened in your life before that caused you to initiate in the behavior of drinking, using, whatever it is. So it is a known entity. It is something you've experienced before. You recognize when it happens, and it gives you a feeling, CBT. It gives you that emotional response, which leads to the behavior, and that's the trigger. But I'm telling you, it doesn't have to be a trigger that sends you off the deep end. It may be a new trigger once you've experienced it, and then it becomes a trigger, but speaking from experience, every day is a different ball of wax. Every day will throw 50 million things at you that, you're okay to deal with. And then there's that occasional thing that just pops out of nowhere that you just don't realize what's going on. And next thing you know, you're starting to have those thoughts. So, I'm not saying don't focus on triggers. I'm not saying that they aren't important. They're very important. We need to understand what overt stimulus is, or stimuli, if you want to be correct. I usually don't. Whatever these overt stimuli are, we have to be aware of them, and other things that go into that category are people, places, and things. People can be triggers, places can be triggered, things can be triggers. Drinking buddies, trigger. My old apartment, trigger. My old car, trigger. Um, going to the gym, trigger. All these things are people, places, and things that I would do, see, be around. And now I know, because I've had to make a list of triggers in the past, some of the overt things that bother me. So I would definitely, in early recovery or anytime you start to question your recovery, go back through your triggers, your overt stimuli, write them down, recognize them, give them the attention they deserve. People, places, and things. Reevaluate who your friends and who the people around you are, because you're only as sober as the worst person that's around you. So if you're surrounding yourself with a bunch of drinkers, you're just asking for a nightmare. Go through those triggers, go through those people, go through those places, go through those things, and try to change what you can. There's going to be a lot of things we can't change. Sometimes you can't change things. You can't just quit your job. You can't just walk off the assembly line at the Detroit Motor Plant, building cars, or I can't just jump out of the truck one day and say, here's your equipment, I quit. I depend on that job to pay my bills. So that's something I can't get rid of. So what do you do as a recovering alcoholic or addict or someone with mental health? What do you do when you have a trigger that you can't get away from? That's a tough one. You know, what would you do? I'll tell you what I do. If something triggers me and I can't get away from it, such as a bad day at work or, driving through a certain part of town where I used to drink all the time, or I used to buy booze at, like, for example, work. Less than 2 miles from my job is the Sheetz gas station where I got booze every single night before I went home. So what do? Well, immersion therapy. I literally go to that Sheetz every day when I'm going from work, from my terminal to my first stop, or at least as many days as I can in a week. Sometimes I miss it, but I try to go in there almost every day. And I go in there, I get a drink or get a water, bullshit with the guy at the counter. I just go in there to teach myself that this place is okay. Granted they have the beer cooler, but nobody says I have to go there and open it, right? So that's a trigger for me that I have to immerse myself in, because that's how I get over it. By showing myself that I can do something without having a negative experience. The gym, it was the same thing. I've gone back and forth with going to the gym over the last 6 months, and I haven't been able to stay in there steady because I go there for a couple days and then I feel okay, and then I go home, and then you know I start to think about how I was with the gym before. I would go every day, sometime twice a day, and I was a gym rat and all this stuff. And then, in my brain, I realized that was another addiction for me, because I needed to do that in order to, you know, keep the weight off or stay in shape, because all I was doing and drinking and not really eating. That's where it got for me, where I just didn't want to do the things that you need to do to maintain your daily routine. So, you know, I'm getting back to the point where I can go to the gym and feel good about it. But the big thing was, I was so comfortable not going to the gym, because for the first time in my life, I was comfortable. I hate that thing. First time in my life, I was comfortable with who I was. So the gym wasn't necessary. But as time goes on, I notice that my mental health slides a little bit quicker when I'm not at the gym, when I don't exercise, when I don't take care of myself physically. So even though I don't want to go, I make myself go. Not as much as I want to. I want to get back to 3 days a week. I'm working on it, work in progress. But once again, sometimes you just have to throw yourself into that environment to get past it. And there's some that you can't. A trigger for me is going into a bar. Am I going to immerse myself at a bar? Hell no. Too many chances of me making a mistake. I have a couple friends that, every time they want to go to dinner, they want to meet at a bar. And I'm like, no, I don't know. No, let's go get dinner. Let's go get dinner where they can have booze, but I'm not going to go strictly to a place where all I would do in the past was go there to get drunk. It doesn't make any sense. There's no legitimate reason for me to be inside a bar when I can get food anywhere else and at places that don't serve alcohol. It's that simple. You know, Driving my car was a trigger. Can't stop driving. I got to go to work. I drive for a living. Some of these things, it's going to be pass or fail. Give it a shot, see it happens. The bar thing. It's just I think that's a good piece of advice that I got early on in recovery, is just stay out of them, as a drinker. If you're a user of substances, and your whole thing's a different get ball of wax to me. I can't really relate to what you guys go through, because everything I took was legal and it was easy to find and you could go anywhere and get it. So I didn't have to play all those silly games. But yeah, sometimes we got to throw ourselves into the environment that, we're used to, because it's just something we have to deal with, like I said, driving to work. I mean, you have to do it. Go into the gym. It's good for you. Golfing. I love to golf. Took me almost, I don't know, 3-4 months before I would even swing a golf club, because I was worried I would drink, and over time, the more I've exposed myself to those situations, the less I think about drinking. I go golfing. I may think about drinking because it's a beautiful day and say, yeah, I'd really like to have a beer today. I'm going to go home and have an NA when I get home, you know, but I couldn't do that in the beginning. I couldn't go golfing and not think about drinking. I thought about it all day. So it's going to be a very touch and go process once you get out of rehab or once you're freshly sober, clean. There's going to be a lot of things that you got to deal with. There's going to be a lot of things that pop up that you just don't expect. You're going to game plan, you're going to have that warrior plan, you're going to have this strategy of how you're going to deal with things. And if this happens, I'm going to do this. If this happens, I'm going to do this. But then when it actually happens, it takes a lot more to stick to the plan than it does to jump off. So my advice when it comes to triggers and relapse is know your triggers, know what overt stimulus screw you up, plan for those because they're going to happen. But don't keep your planning just to the triggers that you know of. Get in a behavioral pattern of maintaining good mental health 24/7. Paying attention to what's going on in your head or how you're feeling every day, and every day evaluating yourself, and every day making sure you get yourself on track in the morning and keep yourself on track throughout the day. Because the minute we deviate from what we know works, that's when our guard falls. And that's where we're at danger of going into relapse. That's when we're in danger of allowing a trigger to trigger us. We have the control. A lot of folks don't know that, but we have the control. We gave it up for a long time. We gave it up to booze. We gave it up to substances, but we have the control. Nobody's going to sit there and tell us we have to drink. Your brain, tricky little bastard they are going to sit there and go, it's okay. It's okay. You can have one. Everything will be fine. You're not the same as you were 2.5 years ago. Well, folks, I'm here to tell you, you are the same person you were before. You just know how to live with yourself better. You've learned how to be self-aware and recognize what's going on in your day-to-day in order to maintain good mental health and keep yourself out of the basement. So once again, folks, thanks for joining me tonight. Check out Channel 4 WTAE TV, 5:30 p.m., November 10th, 11th, and 13th, as they bring light to mental health and first responders. Thank you to Sheldon Ingram for putting this project together. And until next time, just remember the motto: share, help, repeat. Tell your stories, help others, and do it the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day. Love you guys.